It's really turned me into an advocate for lifelong learning, not just because of my affiliation with MCLL, but because I see how valuable it is, how important it is. It becomes, for many people in MCLL, it becomes their main activity. My name's Chris Neal, and I'll be leading or moderating a study group on 1837 to 1867, from rebellion to Confederation. It's a period of Canadian history that I think is rather overlooked. When we think of Canadian history, we often start with Confederation. And it's kind of since Confederation and John A. Macdonald right up to the present. That's kind of the conventional way, but I've always been both puzzled and intrigued by the period before Confederation. 1837, there was a rebellion in Lower Canada and in Upper Canada. The last time I really studied this in some depth was in grade 6. And I think that's way too early to understand what was going on, because actually it was quite a complex situation. And so I've always wondered, well, what happened really with those rebellions? Where did they come from, and why, and how? And this movement to responsible government in Canada, what does it mean? And it always struck me as kind of a complex period, a bit of a boring period. But it's not at all boring. It's actually quite exciting. After this study group, people will understand how Canada went from being a British colony to an independent country, and how it went from being essentially an imperialist colony, which ruled from elsewhere, into becoming a democracy, where Parliament was responsible to the people who elected the Parliament, so that Canadians themselves, people who lived here, were able to govern their own affairs instead of waiting for permission from England to do whatever they wanted to do. English or French, that was an incredibly important achievement, and it's the foundation for our country today. Two rebellions that then led to a real parliamentary democracy for the first time in Canada's history. And at the end of the 1840s, in 1849, April 25th, 1849, we have the burning down of Parliament in Montreal, kind of our January 6th. So that doesn't strike me as boring at all. And then thereafter, in the 1850s, there was the move towards Confederation, especially as Canadian political leaders, and this is familiar to what's going on now, they looked south. They saw there was a civil war in the United States, and there were lots of border disputes that were brewing. And the feeling was that if we don't get together, we could be swallowed up and become a kind of 51st state. So there's a lot of material there, and I'm looking forward to an exciting study group. It's a participant presentation study group, so that many participants will be making presentations. There's still a few empty slots. I'll be doing the initial lectures on a brief historiography of Quebec. There are different interpretations of history, as you can imagine, in Quebec. There's the nationalist perspective, there's the more federalist perspective, one could say, or, you know, Canada friendly, Canada unfriendly. And we already have some really learned people in the study group, but it's open to everybody, and you know, it's a place, an opportunity to learn from those who've done some more studying, but also to do some studying yourself and present. I'm interested in history. You know, I'm not formally a historian, but I've done a lot of I've studied a lot of history, and it's been a passion and interest. I wrote a book actually on an American topic, American history, a biography of a journalist named Carlton Beals, who worked during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in Latin America. It's called Carlton Beals and the Progressive Challenge to U.S. Policy in Latin America. The main title is The Rebel Scribe. But yeah, it's an American topic, so I dove into American history in a big way in the 20th century. During my career, I worked as a communications manager at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And so I know a lot about international organizations, and we looked at everything from the United Nations to NATO to the World Health Organization's role during the pandemic, for example. And it was an interesting lens through which to look at international affairs and how it is conducted. And of course, this has become more topical as we see with the United States pulling out of most of the international organizations in which it's involved and sabotaging others where it remains. So it shows us how important this structure is. I joined in 2021. I joined a study group on Wilhelmine Germany. So that was a historical topic, and I was interested because my mother was a German immigrant, and I wanted to know what was the world in which my grandparents grew up and lived. And I did. I learned a lot about that period in German history from 1888 to the First World War, and it was fascinating. I then stuck around. I moderated a few study groups. I moderated a couple of study groups on international organizations. I also have been president, or vice president, president, and past president of MCLL on the executive.
What was that
which
like?
that was a wonderful experience, very satisfying. It's in many ways like a job because we have something like anywhere between 75 to 150 volunteers, including moderators and hosts and office volunteers and people who organize things and committees. We have 6 committees, we have an executive, we need to fundraise, we need to get members, we need to generate interest in what we're doing. There's an external function. We're part of McGill University, so you have to interact with the dean and the university structure. So it's demanding, but it's interesting and demanding. And I learned about this university environment more, and there's a lot of management involved in leading MCLL. And also, but the satisfying part is to see how much pleasure, how much joy people get out of these MCLL study groups and lectures and just the social interaction that's there. And it's really turned me into an advocate for lifelong learning, not just because of my affiliation with MCLL, but because I see how valuable it is, and how important it is. It becomes, for many people in MCLL, it becomes their main activity. The well they go to, where they exchange with others. It's a place where people know your name and they know something about your identity too. Because in study groups there's wide-ranging discussions, and you tend to meet the same people over and over again, and you get to know them, and it's very satisfying. So yeah, I would highly recommend to anybody who wants to participate in MCLL leadership, do it. It's a great experience.